What we're going to do is factor by grouping. We factor by grouping when there are 4 terms. So when we're looking at this polynomial, notice that we have 4 terms. So that the method that we're going to use whenever we have 4 terms is factor by grouping. How we factor by grouping is we take our first 2 terms and we look for the GCF. And the greatest common factor here is x squared. So when we factor out an x squared, we're left with an x plus 2. Then we take the next 2 terms. We see that they have a -9 in common. That's also the GCF. And so we factor out a -9. So when we divide it by a -9, we get x plus 2. Then when we look at this, we see that they both have an x plus 2 in common. So we factor out an x plus 2. And what's left over is the x squared and the -9. And x squared minus 9 can factor some more to x plus x minus 3 and x plus 3. So our final answer would be x plus 2, x minus 3, and x plus 3. Now that's a fairly difficult factor by grouping. Let's look at some easier ones. In this case, we see that they have an r in common. So we factor out an r and we get an x plus 2. For the next one, we factor out a 5 and we get an x plus 2. And so they both have an x plus 2 in common. And what's left over is the r plus 5. Notice that there's no other factoring that we can do because there's no difference of squares. For the next one, we see that there's an x squared in common, and that gives us an x plus 7. Here we don't see anything, so we just put a plus 1, and that gives us an x plus 7. And we notice that they both have an x plus 7, so we have x plus 7, and then we have x squared plus 1. Now, if it was x squared minus 1, we could factor it some more, but difference of squares, remember, there has to be a difference, a subtraction sign in between. Now, looking at letter C, we see that they have an x squared in common, and after they have the x squared in common, that gives us an x plus 3. Then they have a negative y squared in common, and that gives us an x plus 3. And when we're looking at this, what we notice is that they both have an x plus 3. And so what's left over is an x squared minus y squared. Now notice that this one has a difference of squares, 2 things that are squared with a subtraction sign. So when we take the square root, what we get is an x plus y and an x minus y. Pause the video and try those next 3. So with letter D, what we're looking for is something that the first 2 have in common, and that would be an n. So we have an m plus 4. For the second 2, what we notice is that they have a 2 in common, and that would also be an m plus 4. And when we look closely, we see that both of them have an m plus 4. So we factor out an m plus 4, and what's left over is the n plus 2. So we put n plus 2. For letter E, we see that they both have an a in common, and that gives us an x plus y. For the next one, we notice that they have a b in common. So we factor out a b, and we get an x plus y. We notice that both of them have an x plus y in common, so we factor out an x plus y. And when we look closely, we see that what's left over is an a plus b, so we have an a plus b. For letter F, we're going to take our first 2. We see they have an x squared in common, and what's left over is an x plus 6. For the next one, we see that they both have a negative, so we're going to factor out a -1, and that would be an x plus 6. And we notice that both of them have an x plus 6 in common, and what's left over is an x squared minus 1. Notice that that is a difference of squares. We could take the square root of each one. So what we have is the x plus 6, and then we have an x plus 1 and an x minus 1. We're going to go from factoring to solving by factoring. So notice that these terms, these polynomials have 4 terms. So we're going to factor them by grouping. We're going to group the first 2 and the last 2. So we have an x squared, and then that's an x plus 8. And then we factor out a negative 4, and that also gives us an x plus 8. We notice that both of them have an x plus 8, and what's left over is an x squared minus 4. This is a difference of squares because we could take the square root of each one. So we have x plus 8, x minus 2, x plus 2 is equal to 0. Now, when we're solving it, remember we take the opposites, negative 8, 2, and negative 2. Looking at letter B, we see that they have an x squared in common, and that gives us a 2x plus 1. The back 2, we see that they have a negative 9 in common, and that gives us a 2x plus 1. So when we're looking at this, we notice that they have a 2x plus 1 in common. So we factor out the 2x plus 1. And what's left over is the x squared minus 9. And as you probably guessed, we can factor it some more. We can take the square root of each one of those, and that gives us 2x plus 1. And then we have x minus 3 and x plus 3. When we solve for the 2x plus 1 equals 0, sometimes students have difficulty with this one. This is going to give us a fraction. And as you probably guessed, it's going to be a negative. So it's x is equal to negative 1/2. Remember, it's always the opposite. And then what some students do is instead of putting positive 3, negative 3, they just put plus or minus 3. Now, obviously, you don't have to do that. You could put positive 3, negative 3, but I just want to give you that option. Sometimes saving space, you could just put plus or minus, and that means both the positive 3 and the negative 3. Pause the video and try those next 2. Looking at letter C, we see that they have an x squared in common, and that's an x minus 5. We can factor out a negative 1 here, and then that gives us an x minus 5. Remember, when we factor out a negative, it's like dividing it by a negative. So when we divide it by a negative 1, it becomes a negative 5. We see that they both have an x minus 5 in common, and we have an x squared minus 1. And as we've already discussed in a previous problem, the x squared minus 1 would be an x plus 1 and an x minus 1. And that would be x equals 5 and plus or minus 1. Or you could put negative 1, positive 1. So letter D, we see that they have an x squared in common, and that gives us an x plus 7. We have a negative 4, and that gives us an x plus 7. We see that they both have an x plus 7, and then that gives us x squared minus 4 is equal to 0. We can take the square root of each one, and that gives us x plus 7, and then x minus 2 and x plus 2 is equal to 0. So when we're looking at our answers, negative 7, 2, and negative 2. Or, once again, what we could do is plus or minus 2.